Hello everyone, today I'm going to demonstrate on the Stratford watercolour medium coarse grain watercolour paper. So this is £140, it's 100% cotton. As you can see, today I've actually drawn a little sketch onto the paper and we're going to take that away. You'll see for the purposes of filming, I've actually put some tape down. Now, I don't usually find with this paper that I actually need to stretch it, but for the purposes of filming, it's better to stretch. So I'm going to start with some background. Now, I'd like it wet into wet, so I'm going to apply quite a lot of water just into where I want this background to be. Okay, so I'm going to use some Sheminka granulating colour. A little bit deeper. And I think I'll change my brush to something bigger. So you can see there's a fair amount of water on here. I'm not really worried about how much is on there. The more I've got, the better it will be. And I'm just mixing up some colours on the paper. I quite like green gold colours, so I tend to use quite a lot of that. I'll put some mixed yellow in. And just because I can, maybe a touch of blue. Now from there, I just want to run that around just a little bit. Now I'm just going to stop and just add a few little specks of colour, and again run that around. The colours in the middle is just a little bit too pale, so we are going to add some more. There's also a hair in there somehow. I'm going to have to leave that. Now I'm going to add some salt. I do like the patterns you get from the salt. So this is just plain table salt. Now obviously I've got to let that dry. So we're going to leave that to do its own thing. We'll keep the rest of that page dry. Okay, so you can see I've just basically loosely covered all the areas on the paper. So you can see that there's added salt in the background areas, but it's very loose. Everything has a base coat to it. Okay, so we're now dry. I've got rid of all of the salt, which of course you will need to do if you want to paint on top. So I'm going to start with some yellow.
So I'm just going to cool down just a little bit with some extra water.
Put some on and then I'm going to pull. So I can pull the paint to where I want it and get some variations in the colour as I'm going. Now while it's wet, I'm actually going to take a little bit of the opera pink and just put it in the underside. So it looks like it's just picked up some of the colour from the watermelon. So I just tap that in. There will be a slight pinky tinge to that. And I'm going to do a little bit here as well. So I'm just going to put a light wash at the minute of the ivory black in, and that will just start to give us the colours we're looking for in the right places. Now if you're a beginner, you'll notice that as I'm going along, I'm just going to darken this a little bit more. Each stroke is at the side of the last stroke. It's very important with watercolour not to keep overstroking the same areas. Because not only will you lose pigment, but you'll actually end up with so much brush stroke that you'll end up with far too much texture where you want flat washes. So although I don't want the birds to be particularly flat, I do want them to be particularly shiny eventually. So okay, so I'll let each one of those dry and I will continue to put their markings in. So you can see now I've virtually covered every space on the paper. My second coat has almost dried and I'm going to go back in and work on the background and then come back to my birds. So as these little birds are from the Caribbean, they're called banana quits, and most of the wood out there is actually bleached, so you have this grey feel to all the wood. So I'm going to look at ways of creating, using the texture of the paper, some of the wood grain effects. Okay, now that I've got a little bit of the wood in, what I want to do now is to take a flat brush and go back into my background, and I'm going to just lighten some areas, give them that kind of bokem effect. So I've done this quite easily with just a damp brush, quite stiff. And again, I'm not over scrubbing the paper, just a few repeated strokes, one after the other. Remember to use clean water as well. Tap the brush to get the excess off before going into your paint. And now you know why I wasn't quite so worried about any of my edges, because I can lift a number of the paints out just to get some of these effects. And of course, I'm now going to lift just a little ray of sun. So again, I'm just going to use a damp, actually a wet brush in this case. And the side of a ruler is very helpful for getting sun rays. So again, just tap with a tissue and you will get. So my first job is to just get their little red flecks that they have around their beak in. So I just want to put those in before I lose them. I think that's probably about all I can get in. I think I might just be able to get a little bit in there. Now, when I'm doing black, I like to have the blackest black I can get. So I'm just going to use, well, in this case I'm going to use lamp black, but I like to add a really strong blue to it, so that I get some vibrancy about the black rather than it sinking. As you can see up here, the paint sinks and it becomes very dull. Okay, so I'm going to let the paint run out on its back so it's slightly paler. And again, just let the paint run out. And I can lift some of the highlights out of this, but they will be subtle lifts. You can see that the addition of the blue has just lifted the black so that we don't have a dull, sinking, matte finish to it. His tail looks like it's disjointed, but he has actually got it at an angle. So I'm just going to reflood by tapping just a little bit more around the areas that I want to stay dark. So just tap and release the pigment from the brush. I'm going to move down to the next bird. Now, I'm not necessarily going to get rid of all the black that I originally put, or the undercoat that they had. I will get rid of some of it, well, in fact quite a lot of it, but some of it I will leave showing through. Now I'm not pressing hard with my brush, I'm literally just using the point and I'm almost tapping the paper. So just by tapping I can release some of the pigment in the brush, but without it completely flooding and making a mess. And I'm going to run that out. So again, I'm just using a tapping motion to release the pigment. I'm not picking up any more pigment so that I can just let this run out so it's lighter on one side. And again, I'm butting up my strokes. So this should actually give me some direction of the wing feather. And again, I will let that dry and decide if it needs another coat in a little while. So I'm going to continue and do the black on all the birds. So I'm going to go put one of the eyes in. So we're just going to use plain black. Get this as round as I can get it. And then dot some more back in the centre. And I'm going to repeat that for the rest. So using the pure black, I can now go back and work into some of these markings that banana quilts have. So remember, this is just pure black, and I'm going to put a little bit under the beak, or the lower part of the beak. And because they're little tiny feathers, you should indeed put tiny little marks to suggest that there is more movement there. And I'm going to tidy up some of the wing edges. So again, I'm just using little short strokes to create the feeling of little feathers. So you'll notice with most birds they have a lighter outer ring around their eye. So again, I've left a space for that. And I'm just putting little marks to give the idea that there's tiny little feathers around the face. But do leave a ring around the eye, because generally that is where the eyelid, or eyelids I should say, would be. just going to extend that to the beak here. So again, at this stage, I'm not too worried whether it looks super realistic yet, as it doesn't matter. There's lots more I can do to this. Just going to darken those tail bits before I forget them. Okay, I'm going to let them dry. So again, I'm going to go back to the black blue mix, and I'm going to just put a few darks in their legs. So you can see I've put a grey mix down first, and now I just want some shadow, which I'm just dotting. Just get his elbow right. And again, I might well go back with some pure black underneath to do some shadows underneath the bird's feet. Try not to overdo this part. It's easy to just blanket cover when in fact you need the differences in those tones to create three-dimensional objects. So you'll note that I've done this before. I've done the watermelon, and I'll show you why I have done that. It's all about time saving, which I'm a great fan of. Saving time and effort. Okay, I think that's all the legs done. So I'm going to put some white dots in the bird's eyes. So again, sticking with a small brush, I'm actually going to use some white gouache. So this is still titanium white, but I don't normally put super white highlights in, but we are today. So just a tiny, that was too much, so I'm just going to tap that down. They want to be at the top of the eye itself, not at the bottom or in the middle. I'm going to try and get them at the top. Now, in order to use gouache, you need to keep everything clean. Water clean, brush clean. And if you're going to put it into a palette, palette clean. So again, just the tiniest dot in some of them. And again, you want to let that dry off before doing any more to the birds. So I'm going to go back to my my tiniest little lift out brush. And while the eyes are drying, I'm actually going to just lift a little more out of the backs of the wings. So I want to keep washing and tapping my lift out brush, and I very gently want to pat down to get the excess water back off. We don't want to leave any of that on there. And I don't want to go all the way back to the white of the paper either. So again, we're just doing this a little bit at a time. And I will also take some smaller highlights out of the shoulders. Now, some of your highlights should be quite subtle. Just going to do that again. That was a little bit too subtle. So I'll take a little bit more of a highlight out, I think, just to suggest the shoulders. And obviously I want to take a little tiny highlight out of the beak. So again, I'm more tapping with that one. So I can, with lifting out, you can actually recreate so many more directions of things that perhaps you've painted over or you've forgotten to put in. Remember, I'm keeping these a little bit subtle. I don't want them all the way back to white because there's no need. And again, I think I'll take a little bit out of the shoulder, a bit out of the head, suggest highlighting. Remember that some of these highlights just need to be subtle. They don't need to be taken all the way back. And this is a great way of correcting mistakes as well. So if you've put paint in the wrong place, you can lift out some of the paint. Not all paints come out. And as you remember, I mixed this with a blue. Well, that blue doesn't actually come out, which is another reason I use it under the black, so that I can still have a dark space with only a muted highlight. I'm actually going to create a round back of its head with a highlight. Knocking the camera. Sometimes your brush just will not be fine enough for some of the details you want, but persevere. Even with a small tipped brush like this, you can get lines out, or even dots if that's what you need. And again, this is about how much pressure you don't put on the brush. So again, I'm applying very little pressure, in fact no pressure, just dragging a damp tip through the colour, and it's giving me something that's much more subtle. Right, I need to curve this. So I've got a much finer line with the tip of this brush. So I'm just going to repeat a few more lines. And this is a much easier way to get the edges of some of the wings, or the wing feathers I should say. Remember to always tap it dry though. You want these to dry as quickly as possible. Okay, so now that they are dry, I'm going to do the same with a couple of the eyes. So again, small brush, damp, not wet. And again, I just tap at the bottom edge. Sometimes it takes you a little bit longer with a softer brush. Again, tap. This really only needs to be very subtle. It is enough to suggest that there's a reflection coming back up in the eye. Okay. So I'm going to use some alizarin crimson, which I have here, and I want to put some water down. My brush is a bit mucky. Actually, I'm just going to lift that because my brush really is too mucky. Okay, so I'm going to add plain water, this is clean water, onto the surface, all the way to the edges. Make sure you're adding nothing but clean water. Okay, so I'm literally going up to the edges. That's actually the bird. So again, this is a touch of alizarin, and I'm just going to touch the paper. So this is going to merge all by itself, and then I want to change to an opera pink. So although this looks particularly vibrant, they do dry slightly duller than you put them on. Now I'm actually going to add a little bit of Windsor red into this as well. So again, they all start to mix on the paper. And let's not forget some down the bottom. So again, I'm just touching the paper. Don't need to keep stroking the paper at all. I just briefly touch it and then spend some time getting up to the edges so that there are no gaps. I'm actually going to take the gap out there. And again, I'm going to let that dry. During the time that the watermelon's drying, I can go back again to lifting out. So again, back to my lift out brush and actually start finding the edges of the tree. Well, it was actually a plant in a pot. So you can see I'm just finding the edge. Let's not take off the pink I've just put on, by using water rather than paint. Okay, so I'm just curving it so I get the idea that the stem itself is a curved cylindrical object. And again, I'm not overdoing the takeout. I just need to know that there are textures there that create other objects. So because we've put the salt on, I don't want also to get rid of the textures that the salt has put on. So again, I can get some knobbly bits out. And I'll just strengthen that edge, I think. A little more light. I'm just going to push a little bit of the original colour back into that area so it looks a bit more natural. And then I can start up here. So I can take the light out the edge, and again I can move paint around even while I'm lifting, so I've just picked up some of the darker colour on the edge with the side of this brush, which of course is damp, and I've been able to get some more texture in there. So now I'm going to go across, so I've taken out the edge, but invariably because it's a round object I want to go in a slightly semicircular motion so that it feels like it's round. So I'm just going to take out a little extra, and again tap with a tissue to see what you've actually got. I'm going to take a little bit out here, but not into the shadow part, because I've obviously got to put a cast shadow where the birds are. So I'm just taking out some linear lines. Again, it's really about giving your object character. Don't forget to keep cleaning that brush though, and taking off the excess bead of water. So the more time you spend at this stage, the more realistic this will actually look. It's about being patient and following some of the lines that you would actually see, in this particular case, in wood. Now remember, not all colours come out, but quite often you can get just enough off to create a light effect. So where the colour, the tonal ranges are changing within objects. Okay, so I'm not going to keep all my lines dead straight. I'm going to wiggle a few. And sometimes just dragging a damp brush through dry paint can be enough. So I'll try some of that as well. So it's time to put some pips in. So I'm going to go straight to burnt umber. Burnt umber added with a little bit of the pink, so it's just picking up some of the local colour. Let's add a little bit more in. So again, this is starting with the palest of the colours. I'm not going to worry if these aren't too uniform. So at the moment they've still got to have shadows, darker areas and highlights put in them. And again, we'll let the pips dry off before we do any more, but in the meantime we can actually do a little bit more to the rind. So I'm going to use some green mixed with a little bit of green gold. In fact, a lot more green gold, so it's slightly more limey. And then what I want to do is to actually again go back to lifting so that I can get the rest of this bird back. So I've just put the green where the bird's tummy is. And I think I'll just re-dab that. Again, I can take out a few lighter areas at the top of the pink, again just to suggest that there is a more three-dimensional object in play. And again, I will go back and darken some of those areas. So that they look like they've been picked at by the birds. So you can see I'm not worried about any mistakes that I've made, because I know that I can do something about them. So again, let that dry off and then we can come back and do the darker parts of the pips. So now that it's dry, I can come back, slightly smaller brush with a nice point, blacken the mix down just a little bit with black. So that's the burnt umber and the black together to get some of these darker shadows. So again, very little pressure on this brush. You want to limit the amount of pressure you put on brushes. And this will mean that you do keep your points on your brush while you're painting. So again, I'd let that dry off and then come back and just lift a little highlight. In the meantime, while the pips are drying, I can actually get some deeper, darker shadows from the birds and from one of the branches. So again, I can go back to my black, but again, I want to add something like the burnt umber in, perhaps even a little bit of the blue in, so it's deep dark and not matte. So I'm going to go over here and create a shadow here. And of course the bird himself would create a shadow. The branch would also create its own shadow. But in this case, I'm actually going to start with it close to and then come away, just to suggest that there's a little bit of gap between the two. And there's another one here. So again, same thing, put the shadow in shadow for the bird. And one in here. And I'm just going to darken some of these lines within the tree markings, just on one side. So I'm just going to lift out some highlights out of the pips. And again, don't overdo this. So I'm just using the corner of the brush, which of course I'm keeping damp, not wet, but damp. Tapping dry with a piece of tissue, just to make sure that the small amount of water that I've put on doesn't migrate further. Because obviously into that dark paint it would run and make a hell of a mess. So you can see most of this paint's coming out really, really easily. I'm not having to spend too long dabbing at this paper. It's coming out really, really well. Remember, some of these paints do stain, but you only sometimes just want enough to create a highlight. Now I'm going to take out a little bit through the watermelon at the top. And again, they do have some very fine veiny lines through them, so I could take out some really subtle veins. And again, don't overdo this. Keep your pressure really light. And just because we have pips, we should genuinely have just a little bit colour underneath them to create some three-dimensional shape. So again, tap this on, try not to drag it because you will drag the black and brown mix in, which is not what we want. And again, if you overdo this, you know that you can use your lift out brush and remove a mistake. Okay, so this is the bird's feet. So I'm going to take a little bit of the dark off the bird's feet and actually push it into the pink that I've just put on to create that shadow. Same again. Take a bit from the feet above with a damp brush, and again just pull that into your shadow, and that will be dark enough to suggest that that was a shadow of the bird's feet. Now all that remains is to take some of the background and deepen it. So for the last part, I really want to push some of the background to a deeper set of pigments so that it pushes the birds out a little bit more. So I'm going to go back to some of the original colours I had, get them a little bit stronger. And again, I'm still going to use a wetting to wet so that we don't lose too much of the texture that we had put down first. So I'm going to increase the pink there. I'll increase a little bit of the green. So again, I'm just adding clear water first. And I'm just going to drop in a little bit of the green. Again, this green could very easily destroy a lot of the texture if you're not careful. So you need to manage it a little tiny bit at a time. So I don't really want to have to take out again some of that bokem effect. So again, soften all your edges. Make sure that you don't lose too much of your texture. It's always wise to do this on a wet surface rather than on a dry surface. So I'm going to increase the pink there. And increase the blue. So again, I want to push these two planes apart. So I'm just going to use a lighter green. More of the blue. And remember to soften your edges. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of that space there. And again, that's adding some blue in. I'm not too worried that I've just gone over the edge of my takeout, because again, I can just lift some light back out of there. Now I'm going to let that dry and see what we have left.